Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Facts on the Ground. I'm Jesse Zerwell, and I am joined by my co-host, as always, Misty Winston. And today we're happy to have back on the show a former guest. It's George Szamuely. He is a political analyst. He is also the author of a book called Bombs for Peace, NATO's Humanitarian War on Yugoslavia. And he was recently awarded first prize in the Giuseppe Torre competition, would you say?
Yeah.
For an essay he recently wrote on the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. That's a mouthful. And you can find him online, not just on Twitter, but also at thegaggle.locals.com. And today we're going to speak with George about the Biden administration's approach to Russia and Ukraine and anything attendant to that. So George, thank you very much for joining us again.
My pleasure.
So I wanted to start with a general overview of the Biden administration's approach so far to Russia, and then maybe pivot to how Ukraine fits into that.
Well, when the Biden administration came to power, it was driven by a passionate hostility toward Russia that the Democrats had been cultivating for the 4 years during the Trump years, and of course during the last 2-3 years of the Obama administration, including the period in which the Obama administration sought to frame the Trump people as collaborators with Putin to steal the 2016 election. So Biden came in with all of that. He promised a hostile relationship with Russia, and he indeed delivered by imposing sanctions on Russia for the usual malarkey of accusations. Oh, they hacked into U.S. government institutions. They interfered in the 2020 election, and generally being very, very bad actors over Ukraine. So they imposed these sanctions, but in the meantime, the Biden people put out the story that they didn't want to escalate. Now, when U.S. officials say they don't want to escalate, they mean we don't want you to retaliate. So, we have a right to hit you, inflict pain on you, but if you retaliate, then it's escalation. So they said right away, we don't want you to escalate. But then they suddenly got into the idea into their heads that they want to organize a summit with President Putin. They didn't really explain what the purpose of this summit was, what was the agenda that they wanted to discuss, what urgent issues needed to be addressed. And so they keep now repeating that, well, the Russians are really bad actors. Look what they're doing in Ukraine. Look what they're doing in Navalny. But we want a stable, predictable relationship with Russia. So that's why we want to have a summit. Now, of course, as far as the media are concerned, they imagine that Russians are sitting there, panting at the possibility that, wow, we're going to get a summit with Biden. We're recognized. We're the big boys. We're going to sit at the big table with the big boys. And therefore, the media assume that Russia will, of course, jump at the prospect of sitting down with Americans. But in fact, Russia has been extremely lukewarm about the prospect of a summit, for a very good reason. They saw what happened when Antony Blinken showed up at Anchorage with the Chinese, and he started berating them about values and about, look what you're doing in Hong Kong and what you're doing in Tibet and you're in Xinjiang, and then you're doing this to the Uyghurs. And then the Chinese said, well, we're not going to sit and listen to these lectures. And they gave as good as they got. I mean, it was a completely unproductive meeting. So the Russians really don't want to get themselves into a situation where Blinken and Biden start lecturing them and go through the familiar litany of complaints. Oh, you must release Navalny, stop picking on Ukraine, and what about Belarus, and what about Georgia, and what about interfering in elections in other countries, and what about hacking, and all the usual familiar cliches. They don't want to be in that position. So they've in fact been very cool at this prospect of a summit. They haven't said no, but neither have they said yes. They just say, well, we're kind of still studying the proposal, which is all very strange because the Biden people keep insisting that everything is already, all the planning has all been in very developed stages, and that the summit will take place in June. Well, that already doesn't give very much time, and it's clear that the Biden people don't have any agenda to discuss. What's I mean, normally you have summits with a view to signing some treaties, some major agreements that diplomats have been negotiating for several years, like the SALT agreements or the START agreements or whatever, but there's nothing really here to sign. So as far as the Russians are concerned, what they think is going to happen is that this will be a kind of open-ended meeting, no agenda, and the Americans are going to start complaining and try to show the Russians up before the media of the world. It's a little bit like what happened in Helsinki in 2018, when again Trump had a summit, and although Trump, I think, did want to have a working relationship with Russia, he didn't push for it hard enough. So the media kind of seized on this and simply berated Putin endlessly about the usual stuff. So in the end, there was no agreement signed. No, I don't think there was even a joint communique issued after that meeting. So it was a big waste of time, and the Russians really don't want to go through that.
Sorry to interrupt, but was that the meeting when Putin and Trump met in private for 45 minutes or some such amount of time?
Yes, I mean, I think that.
And that was seized on as
right. That's right. That was
something nefarious.
No, that's right. That Helsinki, but that was also at the G20 meeting. There was, I think, before that, 2017, there was the G20 meeting where also Trump and Putin met in private. And again, the media completely distorted this because, of course, at every summit, the leaders meet in private. There are no reporters present.
Yeah, I remember you tweeted a really good point that Nixon and Khrushchev met in private.
They acted like it was unheard of. This has never happened before. It's unprecedented, and it's happened before.
That's right, exactly. They sit down, and there's no one else present but an interpreter. And then there was something very sinister in Trump demanding that the interpreter hand over the notes of the meeting. He said, "Oh my God, he's demanding the interpreter hand over the meeting." Yeah, because it's government property. I mean, the interpreter, this isn't his own private notes. So I'm going to keep it, so I can write my memoirs. No, it's government property. So of course, Trump said, "Give me your notes." But that's in fact exactly what happens. And the same thing happened when Reagan met Gorbachev in Geneva in 1985. Again, they met one-on-one. There's one interpreter present. And that's it. I mean, the whole point of these meetings is for the two leaders to get to know one another. And then, of course, they have the bigger meeting when all their aides are present. And that's when, the big issues.
Negotiations happen. And there's
exactly
more,
where,
right.
They haggle over treaties and agreements that they can sign. That's when many other aides are present. But the whole point of these one-on-one meetings is for the two leaders simply to get to know one another and to establish some, rapport.
I think you're very right, though, about this whole Biden summit thing. I think it's definitely just a PR move. It seems to me like he just wants to look good in mainstream media, particularly in Western mainstream media. He wants to look like he's the one reaching out. He's the one trying to mend fences and lend an olive branch and all of these things. And it's no surprise that Putin is not super pumped about this. We've spent the past 5 years demonizing, I mean, longer, you're right, because it did go back into the Obama administration. But even just recently, we've been covering the Colonial Pipeline because there's been a massive leak that's been going on since August of 2020. But now there's supposedly been some cyber attack on Colonial Pipeline, which is very convenient. And now they're blaming Russia for it. And so it's just another one of those things that Russiagate will never die. It's everything that ever happens that's bad is Russia's fault. So it's really no surprise that Putin's not like, yeah, let me go hang out with those guys.
That's right.
Of course not.
Well, exactly right. The Russians are very wary of this. And they're also, and this is something that's very important, they are in no mood for this. The Russians are really, pissed off, basically, because they're pissed off with everything that's happened in the last 5 or 6 years. And they are in no mood for lectures from the Americans. They're in no mood for ambushes and so on. And you can see this by the very harsh tone that often comes up from the Kremlin, but even particularly from Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, who's usually very avuncular, courteous, old world diplomat, but he just is very harsh when he talks about it. He said, we can't negotiate with the European Union. So when Borrell, the EU High Commissioner for Foreign Affairs, a couple of months ago went to Russia, and he was warned by the Russians, don't start bringing up Navalny. We're just not going to put up with it. And he went ahead and, of course, brought up Navalny. And then they just simply went into the whole thing of all of the failings of Europe, and how when it comes to European civil rights and so on, the way the Europeans handled their demonstrators, particularly the demonstrators over the COVID lockdowns, the harsh police actions that are taken against peaceful demonstrators. And they said, you're going to lecture us about how we deal with our demonstrators. So they are in no mood. So if the summit does take place, and Blinken starts talking about, well, we stand for values, we believe in the rule of law. You don't. We believe in democracy. You don't. We believe in the rules-based order. You don't. Then they're just going to go into, they're going to list all of America's things. They're going to talk about how you have treated the January the 6th rioters, how you have treated Julian Assange. I mean, it's going to be a real, to do. And the Russians are just not in the mood for it. And that's why Blinken thinks that they're going to sit there and listen to a lecture. Then, he really is even dumber than we think he is.
Yeah. And I watched a recent interview with Putin, and he's typically laconic in his demeanor, but he seems even more so now. And that reminds me of what you were just saying about Russia not taking any bullshit anymore, because it's been years upon years of this nonsense.
And the hypocrisy of it is just overwhelming. I mean, it's like George was saying, everybody, Bernie Sanders wants to, oh, poor Navalny, and he must be released. And where's that tweet about Julian Assange? You have no moral footing here. We have no standing whatsoever to be preaching to anybody about anything, really anything. I mean, we try to complain about, crimes against humanity. Really, the United States of America, the world's largest terrorist organization, is going to preach to somebody else about their really?
Exactly. That's exactly what's going to happen. Because in any case, when you get someone like Navalny, Navalny has been convicted of corruption. It's corruption, the kind of financial malfeasance that is, regularly prosecuted throughout the world. That's very different from the way you have treated Julian Assange. Julian Assange is in a maximum security prison. He's there with child rapists, serial killers, terrorists, the worst human beings imaginable. He's
dungeon
alongside them when he's basically he's done his time for essentially a technical crime, which was the bail jumping. The time is over. He's the judge has ruled that he's not to be extradited, but he's there in prison even
and it's you can also You can also
Americans
see the
want him-
difference in the way that the trials were covered. Julian Assange, you couldn't even get, like, Reporters Without Borders had to fight every day to be allowed into the courtroom. Navalny, media was allowed, like the public was allowed, everybody, there were pictures of him in court. There are some pictures thanks to Randy Credico, who snuck some pictures, and big ups to him for doing that. But there's no pictures of the Julian Assange trial. There was no video feed of the Julian Assange trial. Reporters, different journalists had to like get on some weird video link and try to cover it that way. And we're basically trying to live tweet the most important press freedom trial in history.
Right.
I mean,
No,
and the difference is stunning.
It is stunning. And remember, Navalny was tried, he was convicted, he was sentenced to 3.5 years in prison, but he was given probation. So that was very humane. He then violated the terms of his probation. Well, what happens when you violate the terms of your probation in the United States, in the UK anyway? Well, if you violate the terms of your probation, your prison term goes into effect. That's what happened. Now, at what point was Julian Assange granted probation after he was convicted? No, he was given.
He's never been convicted.
Exactly. maximum penalty in a maximum security prison for bail jumping. And he didn't jump bail, as we all know. He had very good grounds to seek political asylum. I mean, very much in justification. He suspected there was a secret indictment, and the United States wanted to get its hands on him. That's why he sought asylum. So, he didn't want to jump bail, but it was forced upon him. So he was absolutely right in what was expecting him. So for Blinken, and it's his government, it's Blinken's government that is seeking to get its hands on Julian Assange in order to send him away for 175 years. And you're going to lecture somebody else about values? We stand for values. We stand for the rules-based order.
Did you see the tweets that Anthony Blinken put out on World Press Freedom Day? It's amazing. It's astonishing to me that he could put that out and not just collapse from the level of hypocrisy.
I know.
He should change his last name to Blinkard.
That's it. And then when the two of them, Blinken and the UK Foreign Secretary last week in London at the G7 Foreign Ministers meeting, they were all talking about this World Press Freedom Day and that we care so passionately about journalistic freedom. I mean, others don't. Hey, we have values. Russia, China, they don't care about press freedom. They're just not on the elevated level that we are at. We love.
We're on a slightly more elevated
it's
plane.
The foundation of democracy. That's what they always say. It's the foundation of democracy. Okay, then why is Julian Assange in prison then? Please, somebody explain that to me. I mean, when the president of Azerbaijan can call out your hypocrisy to your face in an interview with the BBC, you have issues. There are problems with what you're doing. It's the hypocrisy is overwhelming on that front. It really is. And again, and we expect Putin to be like, sure, yeah, let's meet up so I can hear more about how I'm doing everything wrong and you're doing everything right. It's ridiculous.
Right. So I think that the other aspect of it is, of course, is that there may be some calculation in the minds of the Biden people that, hey, well, China is the big threat. Why don't we take Russia away from China, get Russia on our side, and then we can use Russia against China? It's like a bloody good idea. Now,
never going to happen.
Nonsense. We'll do the sort of Nixon Kissinger thing in reverse. I mean, it is idiocy. First of all, Russia, has absolutely not the slightest interest in breaking its ties with China. I mean, China is a huge economic partner, big consumer of Russia's energy, and they are very, very close. There is no daylight between them. So why would Russia turn on China in order to align with the West that has, lied and betrayed them ever since the pledges that were made to Gorbachev in the late 1980s that NATO will not move 1 inch to the east. We will not take any advantage at all over the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact. We pretty promised that it won't happen. And so Russia's going to forget that. Yeah, right. We want to be with the West. We want to wage war against China. But I imagine that these people really do think that. I mean, if you read foreign policy thinking. They were constantly thinking, oh yeah, well, Russia and China, they have this historic enmity. We can easily exploit that and get Russia on our side, and then that's great, and then we'll have this against China. Like the two of you fight it out. Let's of course. It's itself is nonsensical because, of course, Russia and China there is no historical enmity between Russia and China. People generalize there was a brief period during the Soviet Union in the Khrushchev era, from about, Khrushchev until about Gorbachev, when relations between the Soviet Union and China were bad. But for most of Soviet history, relations between the Soviet Union and China were very good. Stalin had good relations with both Mao Zedong and with Chiang Kai-shek. In the 19th century, Russia and China had good relations. There are no outstanding territorial disputes between Russia and China. So this vain hope of the Bidens and Blinkens and others that somehow, well, Russia and China, they're really deadly enemies and we can just break them apart and then we'll get them to fight each other and then we're off the hook. It ain't gonna happen. And Russia is not buying any such nonsense.
Right. And that's what I wanted to ask you about, is how much of this do you think is containment on the part of the Biden administration with regard to Russia and its relationship with China? And how much of that containment do you think is divide and conquer? So we know there's the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, which the US and most of the West is not happy about at all. It's a Russian and Chinese endeavor for the most part. So how much of this do you think is simple containment? And then how much of that containment is to try to break up this geopolitical alliance that Russia and China have?
Well, I think that really goes to the heart of it. So on the one hand, you have this hostility toward Russia inherited from the Obama era, at which time, Obama and Biden, they were making a ton of money. A lot of people in Washington and New York have been making a ton of money from doing business with China. So that was all very nice. I mean, there's not that much money to be made in business with Russia. So they were all doing nicely, particularly the Bidens. I mean, we know all about the Biden family and how much they were making from China. So that was all great in those Obama era. Remember when Biden was asked, Chinese are going to eat our lunch. Oh, come on, man, they're not going to eat our lunch. They're our friends. Because just about everybody in the U.S. elite was making money hand over fist from China. What then happened was Trump kind of changed the whole perception of China. It's no longer sort of the goose that laid the golden egg, but I mean, suddenly China was seen as a major rival, because, again, people like Obama, Biden hadn't really noticed, wow, China is now the sort of number one economy in the world. So Trump essentially affected this change in attitudes towards China. So on the one hand, you still got this Russophobia that's prevalent throughout the Democratic Party, among the media and so on. But then you have this other idea that, hey, well, maybe Trump had a point. Maybe China is a serious problem. So then they go, okay, well, all right, well, maybe we'll tone down this anti-Russia rhetoric and against China, because China is the big power, Russia is the smaller power. So we'll just do the Nixon-Kissinger in reverse, because at that time, China was the sort of the junior part of the Soviet Union. So China against the Soviet Union. So now they say, okay, well, we'll partner with Russia against China. The problem is, as I said earlier, is that it's a non-starter. I mean, that train has left the station. I mean, the Russians are so disillusioned with the West, so disillusioned with everything that happened from the late 1980s onwards, that they have zero interest in cultivating bad relations with China in order to get in with the West, who they know will betray them anyway. I mean, it's like, if there's one thing I was certain of, whatever promises the West is going to make to us, they're going to renege on. and lie to us and then land us in the soup. So
Yeah,
they know
and
all of
we
this.
we saw that with Yeltsin,
Silly idea
starting
that
with
they can go
Yeltsin.
with. Right, exactly. But I say it really started with the commitments that were made to Gorbachev at the time of the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact. We will not take advantage of this, and of course they did. And so they basically they didn't just move all their forces east. They scooped up every one of the Soviet Union's allies, including member states of the Soviet Union, into NATO. And then in 2008, the cherry on the cake, they promised NATO membership to Ukraine and to Georgia. So it's clear what the West goal here was. I mean, the West basically wants to completely, I mean, with the exception of Serbia and Bosnia-Herzegovina, there are no Russia allies anywhere in Europe. I mean, that's a historic shift against Russia. I mean, Russia has just been pushed out from Europe. And clearly, with that promise of NATO membership to Ukraine and Georgia in 2008, the goal was of the Soviet Union. So
it always kind of felt to me like the Russiagate stuff, the attacks on Russia were kind of a placeholder. We talked about this with somebody else, but it felt like we weren't really quite ready to go after China in a hard way. And so we needed a scapegoat, we needed a boogeyman. And because of, the Cold War, we already had this sort of ingrained fear of Russia. So they were able to exploit that and use that as a way to, put out this boogeyman and this kind of a placeholder for what they were really moving towards, which was more attacks on China, and which attacks on Russia are attacks on China because they are allies, and so that always kind of felt like this desperate, we need somebody to blame now. Let's go with Russia, and then we can. And now it feels like the attacks on China are kind of ramping up in a bigger way. The attacks on Russia are certainly not going away. Like I said, they're now blaming them for a cyber attack on Colonial Pipeline. There's a whole bevy of things that they like to blame Russia for constantly. So it really it's really like kind of fun to watch in a weird dystopian way, because it's, to those of us who see it, it's obvious, and they're very good at the level of propaganda that they're able to put out, and it's very convincing. They're very good at what they do. So yeah, it's this weird thing where I feel like Russia has just been used at this point now as a way to get to China, and Putin's not a moron. He knows this. He's a very smart dude. He knows exactly what's going on.
Right.
But I think. Go ahead, George.
No, that's exactly right. Well, propaganda becomes very easy because the media are so happy to serve as attack dogs for the political establishment. So whenever you read these interviews that Blinken gives to reporters like Andrea Mitchell the other day, the questions are all along the lines of, well, what are you going to do if Russia invades Ukraine? Putin is a well-known liar. Why would you believe anything that Putin says?
Just yesterday, Reuters put out a thing where they were talking about Victory Day, and every year Russia holds like a military display, and it's a big thing, it's a celebration. And Reuters put it out like Russia shows a force of military might amidst tensions. It's like, really? That's your headline for this?
So let's talk about that. These so-called border buildups of military. We always hear about Russia massing its military on the border of Ukraine, particularly in the Donbass region in Crimea. We never hear about the fact that the US and its NATO allies mass military forces on the border of Russia in Poland, I believe it is, if I'm not mistaken. We never hear about that side of it. We always hear about the Russian side of it, and it's always posed as aggression. And in that, I think, very inaccurate depiction, Ukraine comes into the picture, and Ukraine's sort of been caught in the middle of this Russiagate, anti-Russian, whatever sort of campaign the US is trying to wage here, because despite what they've done, it still seems very nebulous. So how would you say that Ukraine factors into this? Because to me, it seems like, again, a country that's caught in the middle, although there are some very powerful factions with ties to neo-Nazism who are trying to put the country into a resurgence, primarily for white Ukrainians, white supremacist Ukrainians. But
Right.
and that's something that Obama and Biden helped initiate there in 2014 with the so-called Maidan
And
massacre.
what's her name? Victoria Nuland? Victoria
Yeah.
Nuland. And now Joe Biden's got her in his administration as well.
Number 3 in the State Department. That's exactly right. Look, Ukraine is useful to the United States and to NATO in general as a cudgel with which to beat Russia. They have no interest in Ukrainians, the territorial integrity or whatever of Ukraine. It's just useful as a cudgel. They want bad relations between Russia and Ukraine, and they've achieved that. Now, the Ukrainians are, of course, the big losers in all of this. They embarked on this coup in clear violation of all of the commitments that were made when an agreement was signed between the previous president Yanukovych and the opposition, which is there would be elections. This was in February of 2014. There'd be elections in December. Within hours, that agreement was thrown out, and Yanukovych had to flee for his life. All of this was encouraged by the Obama people. I mean, we know this from that phone call, the famous phone call between Newland and Jeffrey Pyatt, the U.S. ambassador, that this was the plan all along.
We should also add that John Kerry was party to that as well.
That's exactly it. And so, what you have now is, on the one hand, Ukraine was robbed blind. I mean, when you have Biden's son, who was collecting about $1 million a year without having once stepped in Ukraine, without having any knowledge of the energy industry, knowing neither Russian nor Ukrainian, but he was just stepping. He was taking $1 million a year out of a very poor country, and so that's what the West does for Ukraine. So now they're egging on President Zelensky to mount an offensive in the Donbass, to defeat the Donbass. It's a very cynical maneuver. I mean, which is that either Zelensky wins, the Donbass is defeated, Russia is humiliated, or alternatively, Russia intervenes militarily, and what happens then is, of course, relations between Russia and Europe freeze up for a general dealings, no any relations at all. So it'll be great for the Defense Department, the military. Everybody would do well out of that. So as far as the the Americans were concerned, it's a win-win. Ukraine wins, Russia's humiliated. Ukraine loses, NATO gets a shot in the arm. Something then happened. I think the Biden people decided that they didn't really want to get a humiliation. They couldn't quite go through with this cynical plan. Remember, they were going to send in those 2 warships into the Black Sea. And then they changed their minds. They said, we're not going to send these warships into the Black Sea. They clearly got the message, and the Russians were unambiguous, that if there is an offensive launched by Zelensky against the 2 breakaway republics, Russia will intervene militarily to protect its nationals, because there are now a lot of Russian citizens living there. So the Biden people basically got cold feet. They couldn't really go through with it. And I think that moment when they backed away and then started talking about the summit is clearly they decided that they needed to shift course, because this policy of confrontation was getting very dangerous, and they didn't want to get themselves into a humiliating situation. Apart from anything else, there are American forces and British forces and NATO forces in Ukraine. So any kind of Russian offensive, all these people will easily be defeated, and they'll be, you'll have Americans in captivity, and it'll just be a massive embarrassment for Biden. It'll almost certainly bring his presidency down. To be replaced immediately by Harris. That may well be down the road, but this will just bring it to an end. So they got cold feet and decided that this is not on. So they keep still talking about we support Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity, and we will never recognize Crimea as part of Russia. We're with you 100%. But instead, they keep talking about all these reforms that Ukraine must undertake. So they kind of want to focus on that and get away from direct military confrontations with Russia.
Yeah, and I think you could see it from the moment Zelensky came into power, and they were trying to distort the conversation he had with Trump into some sort of quid pro quo. And if you read the transcript, there is no quid pro quo. It's simply a basic statement about, hey, I heard this is going on. You are the president of the country. If you could you look into this? Because these are serious allegations. And what I'm referring to there is Burisma and the natural gas shenanigans involving Hunter Biden.
Yes.
And a lot of the Burisma news has gotten short shrift as almost if it's a conspiracy theory, and people are just
so annoying.
Yeah. And
that you can't even tweet about, like, if you tweet about it, they will make you take your post down. Like, at least they were when it first came out. That was, you couldn't even put up a tweet about it. They were like suspending you, giving you a 12-hour suspension until you took the tweet down. I think was it the New York Post, I think, lost their account for
that was the subsequent, that was the Hunter Biden laptop.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right.
But the Burisma, but you're right about Burisma as well, because the Burisma, where they say, the allegations against the Bidens have all been discredited. Like, who discredited them?
Right.
They're all been discredited.
Joe Biden investigated himself.
The Washington Post discredited them.
Exactly. Yeah. So what we know about Burisma is there was an investigation being conducted by the Ukrainian prosecutor into Burisma. We know about all of this. We know why Hunter Biden was hired by Burisma. It was precisely because they wanted this investigation to go away. We know this.
Joe Biden got the guy fired. He got the guy fired and then bragged about it on camera. Like, it's not a secret. It's not a conspiracy theory. He bragged about it on camera.
Shokin, the attorney general, I believe his name is Shokin.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he said, yeah, I was fired. Poroshenko fired me for that very reason. So other people always been discredited. How is it discredited? We have Shokin's testimony. So we have what Biden says. It's like, but it's a great thing, again, in the media, where they just say, all they have to say is, it's been debunked. Debunked. That's it. It's gone. No. We know exactly that was the reason why they gave Hunter Biden this cushy job. They wanted the U.S. government to lean on the prosecutor to end this investigation. And what do you know? That's what happened. The investigation of Burisma came to an end a few months after the firing of Shokin. So you have the whole sequence of events, so that by January 2017, the investigation was over. There was an agreement signed with Burisma, and it was over. So, there's a real, a great timeline that it works. So, the whole idea that this has been debunked is laughable. But again, it's nice to have a media that is as incurious as it is.
Yeah, and I also saw that conspiracy theory approach seep into independent media. And I don't mean to call anybody out, but it must be said in the name of transparency that Aaron Mate said on at least one of his shows that he thought there was quid pro quo in that exchange. And I don't know where that came from based on all the work he's done to debunk Russiagate, but almost immediately, it was not just mainstream media, it was some independent media outlets and journalists who were saying, well, this is too obvious, so it can't be true. Well, the fact is that it's so obvious because it is true.
Yeah.
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 So, of course. Look, I mean, the Biden family, is a racket. I mean, we know this. So this is a racket for enrichment. I mean, how does this person who gets into Congress, basically, he doesn't have any money and gets to be fabulously wealthy? I mean, how does that happen? Well, it happens because he uses his office in order to enrich himself. But he does it, in a subtle way, because he enriches his family. So the money goes to his family, it doesn't go directly to him, but of course, then eventually it was transferred from the family to him. And that's, we go on with that's the mechanism with the Bidens. But we know now also that Ukraine is clearly wants to run interference or Hunter Biden. So they want to completely wipe the slate clean and crack down on any media, any alternative media within Ukraine that might call into question the relationship of the Bidens with Ukraine. I mean, again, there's clearly a record of it. There's the crackdowns against the media that are taking place in Ukraine are directly connected with, an attempt to crush the people in Ukraine who have reported about the Biden's activities in Ukraine. So it's a nice little service that they're performing for Biden.
Yeah. And I think it's so obvious, it's so in our faces, and to not accept it for what it is just adding more fuel to
That's what's terrifying
fire.
about the attacks on the media across the globe have become so blatant and in our faces, and still people don't care. They really don't seem to care at all. It's not just in Ukraine. They're doing, I mean, look at what happens to journalists at protests in the United States right now. In the United States, I mean, you have journalists, they're having you line up so that they can take your picture and take pictures of your IDs, and then they're telling you that they're tracking you on an app, and that's terrifying. That should not be the way that we're treating journalists. It's supposed to be, we're supposed to have a free media. We do not have that in any way right now. It's a propaganda machine. And I've been trying to tell people the fight over narrative is absolutely the front line. That is everything. It affects everything. Look at the propaganda they're able to push on us now and how effective it is. We can't win anything unless we fight that battle first. It's really terrifying.
And the fact that there has to be a World Press Freedom Day, that every day isn't World Press Freedom Day, speaks to the problem of media, of journalism as we know it right now.
Because, of course, what's really happening is that the mainstream media serve as tools for the dissemination of lies. Now, let's just look at in the recent past. Now, we had the lie about the Russian bounties on U.S. servicemen. This was a story clearly put about by people within the U.S. intelligence services who opposed Trump in general, but his withdrawal from Afghanistan in particular. So they put out this story. New York Times happily reported this absolutely nonsensical story for which there was no evidence, and it didn't even make any sense on its own terms. But nonetheless, they happily put this story out. And then, when, again, very recently, when the US government policy changed under Biden and said, yeah, we're going to pull out of Afghanistan after all. And so suddenly they said, well, there wasn't really very much evidence for the bounty story. Okay, well, that's it. Sorry, my mistake.
Whoopsie-daisy.
There wasn't any evidence whatsoever.
No.
And then again, what about the story about the January the 6th riots? I mean, remember how all of the media reporting 5 people were killed on that day. 5 people were killed on that day. Now, we now know that Brian Sicknick, the police officer, he died of a stroke, had nothing to do with anything that happened that day. Then we had, I think, 3 people who had other complications, heart attack, one died of a methamphetamine overdose. And then, of course, the one person who did die on that day was, of course, a Trump supporter who was shot dead by a police officer. But nonetheless, the media continued to say 5 people died on that day, as if somehow the Trump people were responsible for 5 deaths. Now, what you have to then find out, why did it take 3 months for us to find out that this officer, Brian Sicknick, died of a stroke, and that he didn't have his head bashed in by a fire extinguisher, and in that his death had nothing whatever to do with January the 6th. Who kept this quiet? I mean, who knew about this? Why?
Well,
why
that's
was
how
this kept quiet?
propaganda always works. They say the lie, they say it often, and they say it loud, and then the retraction is months later, and they whisper it,
Right.
and that's how it always
Right.
works.
And
Right.
as you said before, Misty, it's narrative control. And
Mhm.
sometimes it takes them 3 months to form a narrative that suits
It's
them.
beneficial. Yeah.
Right.
Well, look at this way. I mean, look at the rewards. I mean, today we heard, or maybe it was yesterday, I don't know when it was announced, that Susan Hennessy has been appointed counsel to the National Security Division of the DOJ. So that's another Russiagator who has now been promoted and now has a big job in the DOJ. That's on top of Lisa Monaco. I think she's Deputy Attorney General, so I think she's pretty much running the DOJ. That's on top of Susan Rice, another crazy Russiagator. She's Chief Domestic Advisor. That's on top of Jake Sullivan, one of the key purveyors of the Russiagate hoax. So these people
also, I can quote him verbatim. Al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria. That's quote unquote.
What a good guy
quote.
he is.
And
Great guy. Yeah.
he's in the Biden administration now.
He's a national security advisor. That's exactly right. Yeah, that's it. So now you've got all of these people who have been handsomely rewarded, and you think, but they put out complete lies. Not only did they smear a whole bunch of people unfairly, destroyed their lives, and the way they destroyed the life of, say, Michael Flynn or Roger Stone. But now they got these big jobs. I mean, this is even worse than what happened after the invasion of Iraq, when all the people who actually planned that insane invasion then all got themselves nice media gigs, the Bill Kristol and Max Boot and
Paul Wolfowitz wound up at the World Bank or the IMF.
It's a big circle. Like they just rotate through positions, and all of these horrible people that are responsible for all of these atrocious things are constantly failing upwards. They're either, sent to work at MSNBC, or they're sent to work at some lobbying group, or they're given some ambassadorship somewhere or whatever. And it's just all the same psychopaths.
That's it. Exactly. So you get rewarded. I mean, that's it. So you put out lies. You don't know how many people, innocent lives, are killed as a result. Your countries are destroyed, and you just have a nice safe job. Now, the people who, however, warned that the Iraq caper would turn into a disaster, they haven't been rewarded. They were right. They haven't been. There's no reward.
They lost their jobs. Look at Chris Hedges.
They lost their jobs. Same with Russiagate. The people who pointed out that Russiagate was a complete crock, that there was no way in the world that Russia would intervene in the U.S. election in any major way, for a very simple reason. They wouldn't want to antagonize the person that the Russians thought was going to win the election. The Russians thought Hillary Clinton would win. Why would they want to intervene in an election against her and then suffer with her wrath after the election? It made no sense. Russians are usually very cautious. They don't take stupid risks like that on behalf of someone they didn't believe would win. They didn't think Trump would win. And so all of that was a completely nonsensical. It failed on a common sense level.
And for Russia to intervene in U.S. elections, the calculus of that doesn't make any sense, because Russia's already been demonized by the US. That's essentially etched in stone. This is just adding more etchings to that stone, but it goes nowhere. And I really think that, as you alluded to earlier, Russia is sitting back and probably, at least internally, laughing at the United States because it's so ludicrous at this point.
It is really ridiculous. There are still people who believe that Russia interfered in the 2016 election, though. And my question to them is, somebody tell me what they got out of that if they did, because Trump was incredibly aggressive towards Russia. They didn't get anything out of supposedly helping Trump. So what point would that have done? Like, what point would there have been for them to do something like that? And like you said, nobody thought Trump was going to win. There's no way that Putin was like, yeah, Trump's totally going to win. We should. No, I mean, it made no sense whatsoever that they would take a chance like that. That anybody with any level of brain activity would take a chance like that. It's completely ridiculous.
Exactly. But it was a lie. They put this lie out. It served to justify what the Obama administration did in spying on the Trump campaign, in smearing the Trump people, and in hobbling it. Because by hobbling the Trump team and then helping to get this whole impeachment thing going on the basis of nothing, I mean, essentially, the Trump presidency would pretty much start out, hobbled, but got both legs broken. And it's kind of what happened. I mean, he was on the defensive throughout, particularly on what would have been his signature policy, because he did want to improve relations with Russia. He was unable to do so, and it served the purpose. And to the extent that, the media kept repeating, and all the hangers-on Twitter and Facebook kept repeating, oh, Trump's a traitor, Trump's a traitor, Trump is Putin's agent. It ensured that relations with Russia remained terrible, and that, there was constant shadow over Trump. So
yeah, I think the height of the madness too was when the New Yorker published one of its weekly issues, and the cover was Trump riding behind Putin on a unicorn, and then there were the colors, the LGBTQ plus colors, somehow
there were a lot of
associated with
really disgusting homophobic memes about Trump and Putin.
But that points to the brain rot that descended from Russiagate, that
supposed liberals.
I'm not saying that the New Yorker.
And on the homophobic, just to follow up on that again, with liberals, they can use all these memes whenever they want. Homophobia. Look at when Glenn Greenwald makes very justifiable criticisms of journalists, some of whom happen to be women. Immediately, the whole Twitter sphere goes, "Oh well, of course,
he's sexist."
Glenn Greenwald is picking on young women. I don't think Greenwald likes women. Ha, 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 hint, hint. So, liberals think, oh, hey, we're liberals, so we get a free pass. We can do all, we can have cartoons of Trump and Putin kissing on the mouth because we're liberals. So, we're okay. We're obviously tolerant. And so we can just play this. Or when, what's the name of the guy, that late night host?
Jimmy Fallon.
Stephen Colbert.
Colbert, the one, when he said, he suggested that there was some kind of oral sex going on between three. I mean, I get a free pass, because I'm a good liberal, so I can make these homophobic jokes.
I can make these homophobic jokes and then go home to my Upper West Side penthouse and forget about the fact that the jokes I'm putting out there are actually dangerous lies, and they're not
dangerous
funny.
Lies, offensive, hurtful to the LGBTQ community.
And they're not even funny.
They're not even funny. No,
he's such a drip.
He is. He's become the character he used to make fun of. Really.
Right.
That's right. Yeah.
It's embarrassing. I'm embarrassed for him.
Well, it's an interesting case of, there are people who launch their careers pretending to be anti-establishment, but when all along their dream is to become pillars of the establishment. So, throughout my life, I've come across many such phenomena, hey, I'm against the establishment, but can I please get to be editor of the New Yorker? And can I please get to be editor of Harper's Magazine? That's your dream, even as you're pretending, hey, I'm hitting the man. So
Yeah, because once you get that first hit of access to power as a journalist, whether you're in the White House press pool or you're sitting across the street from Port Authority in the New York Times office, you're obsessed with access to power once you get that first hit from it. And it's not about criticizing power anymore. It's not about monitoring the centers of power anymore. It's about currying favor with them and
being their friends, going to dinner parties. WikiLeaks revealed that
becoming
over 60 journalists were coordinating with the Clinton campaign, but that's not interfering with an election. But memes about masturbating with Jesus that supposedly came from some Russian troll farm, that's interfering with an election. It makes no sense. It's completely ridiculous.
And it's even worse than that when the one country that we know for certain interfered in the 2016 election was the United Kingdom because of Christopher Steele, who published that dossier. Nothing interfered as strongly in that election.
I would venture to say that Israel and Saudi Arabia both influenced
the
election
they probably did,
as they always do.
Of course they did. But here we have a documentary proof that Steele did this. And Christopher Steele, who had a senior position in MI6, and everyone knows no one ever retires from MI6. In other words, the quote, retire, unquote, means you're still working for MI6. So this was MI6 directly interfered in that election because MI6 was very, very concerned about Trump.
And the Clinton campaign hired him. So the Clinton campaign hired a foreign spy to get dirt on her opponent. But she's nobody ever talks about that aspect of it. Nobody ever calls her out for because they always try to say that Trump was a Russian agent. Well, Hillary Clinton literally hired a foreign spy to go and dig up dirt on her opponent. That's amazing. I mean, they talked about, the so-called Trump Tower meeting and how that was so scandalous. No, Hillary Clinton paid somebody from MI6 to go get information on Donald Trump so that she could beat him in an election. And she still lost, by the way, which I still think is endlessly hilarious. But yeah, it's the hypocrisy and the American exceptionalism is overwhelming.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And when you think about that ridiculous Trump Tower meeting, which lasted all of 20 minutes because this woman managed to sort of wangle her way into a meeting with the Trump people, though she really didn't have anything other than, she didn't like Bill Browder because she's a lawyer, her client was involved.
Are you referring to Maria Butina?
Oh, yeah, Natalia Veselnitskaya. Yeah, there was.
Okay.
Yeah, Veselnitskaya. She was the one who got that meeting with the top people in the Trump campaign. They thought they were getting some juicy information about the Clintons, but she didn't have anything. Her obsession was Bill Browder because her client was involved in a legal dispute with Bill Browder. And that's why the meeting came to a very swift ending, because when they realized that she didn't have anything, they brought the meeting to an end. But the point is, how much mileage that the media and Congress, Congress had endless hearings about this Trump Tower meeting.
which we should note was not illegal.
No, of course it's not illegal.
No.
It's not illegal. There is such a thing as the First Amendment. The First Amendment means you have an unrestricted right to information from whatever source.
And it's opposition research. Every politician does it. All of them. Every last one of them does it.
Exactly. If somebody comes to you and says, hey, I have important information that you ought to see, you have every right to say, yeah, I want to see this information. There can be no restraints on anyone seeking out information from wherever. You go to the Kremlin, get information there. You go to Beijing, wherever. Malawi, whatever place, you have a right to information. There was nothing illegal about it. Again, this was all cooked up. The media suggested there was something sinister about this. Nothing, absolutely nothing in it.
Yeah, and hindsight is always 20/20, but it seems like during the 4 years that Trump was president, these national security state careerists like John Brennan, for example, or James Clapper, while they were cooling their heels as MSNBC and CNN contributors, that they were also playing a long game in a sense, and biding their time and, not knowing definitely, but probably suspecting very strongly that Trump wasn't going to win a second term. Maybe they knew about machinations that the DNC was perpetuating at that point. But now they're back in the driver's seat, and it's like they're back in their champagne room, so to speak.
Right. And it's very interesting because the people, the Obama people, who essentially framed the Trump campaign in order to essentially bring criminal charges and then to impeachment and so on. They're back. They're back in the Justice Department. And guess what they're doing? They're doing exactly the same thing. So they go after Giuliani. Now, why are they going after Giuliani? I mean, you're raiding his apartment and his office because you're investigating violation of the Foreign Agents Registration Act, which is simply a technical violation. There's no criminal penalty involved. All that happens is that you at worst you pay a fine and can register as a foreign agent. So they take this step. Why are they taking this step? Well, obviously because they're looking for information to frame Rudy Giuliani and, of course, ultimately to frame Trump. Why? Because Giuliani was investigating the Bidens. I mean, he has been in Ukraine investigating the Bidens. So they go after Rudy Giuliani, seize all of his recordings, all of his notes with clients. So it's, in other words, violating lawyer-client privilege in order to go after the enemies of the president. Again, the media just simply say, "Oh, nothing to see here." There's nothing to see. Biden's government is going after one of its enemies. No, nothing to see here. They're obviously just investigating violations of FARA, and that there was obviously Trump was doing something wrong in trying to get the Ukraine ambassador fired. Well, Trump, the ambassador to Ukraine, this Masha Yovanovitch, I don't know if you remember her, that simpering little woman who apparently thought that an ambassadorship is a job for life and that no one has a right to fire her. The media suggests that there's something untoward about Biden and Trump trying to get her fired. Well, Trump can fire her any moment he wants, in the same way that Obama, the very first act as president, he fired every single US ambassador. These are the perks of a president, that he hires and fires ambassadors. So all these things are being suggested by the media, that there's something untoward about Trump and Giuliani, and that clearly the Justice Department is engaging in some serious investigation. Well, of course they're not. First of all, they want to destroy Giuliani, but ultimately they want to bring some kind of criminal charges against Trump, who they see as clearly their major rival in 2024. Now, it's essentially you're using the tools of government to destroy your political opponents. And you think, well, isn't that what countries that the United States is always criticizing do? I mean, isn't that what you normally do? You're using the power of government to bring criminal charges against your political opponents. Hey, isn't that when you're always talking about values and all these terrible things that third world countries or countries without our finest susceptibilities like Russia and China, isn't that what you're supposed to do? No, it's the United States that's doing it. It's the United States that's going after its opponents. So all of the people from who were there with Obama did that, all of that under Obama. Now they're there 4 years later, and they're doing exactly the same thing.
Yeah, and it's arguably more nefarious than Trump, because at least Trump would come out and say what he was going to do, or what he'd already been doing, unbeknownst to the polis. But now we have Biden, who's arguably doing worse things than Trump did when he was in office. But there's this patina of a nice
Uncle Joe,
liberal aristocrat.
Mm-hmm.
And
right.
That's very dangerous, because a lot of Americans don't see through that, and they think that he's this counterbalance to the so-called madness of Trump. And we actually have to wrap right now, because we have a hard stop for a 1 o'clock meeting, but if you're game for it, we'd like to continue this conversation.
Yeah, we'd love to have you back on.
And do a part two, because I have a bunch of notes here that I didn't even get to. But I think that are important to bring up in what's happening. So
yeah, we can definitely schedule that.
It would be great to do a part two if you're
absolutely, absolutely. You want to do a part two? Happy to do it. Yeah, absolutely.
okay.
Great.
So George, thank you very much for joining us.
Yes.
It was
my pleasure.
A good conversation as always. And as we just mentioned, we'll be doing a part two on this discussion because it's longer and has more substance than we can fit into an hour. But thanks everybody for watching. Our guest today has been George Szamuely. He is a political analyst. He is also the author of a book called Bombs for Peace, NATO's Humanitarian War Against Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia, correct?
Yugoslavia, that's right.
Okay. And that's something we'll hopefully be talking about possibly in the next episode, because there's a connection here between what the US is trying to do with Russia and China as far as these soft interventions so far, and other US-led interventions that have happened in the past under the so-called responsibility to protect. We can go back before that, but I think there's a lineage there that's important to touch on. So next time we'll get into that and a bunch more. So George, thank you for joining us. Viewers, you can also find George at thegaggle.locals.com. And it should also be noted, as we mentioned in the beginning, that he recently won the first prize in the Giuseppe Torre Award. And that was for an essay on the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, which has been ongoing for many years now. And if you know any of the key players like Ratko Mladic and Radovan Karadzic, it's well worth reading, and it has a connection, as I said, to what we've been talking about with Biden and Russia and Ukraine and Iran and Syria, which hopefully we can get into next time. So anyway, to close out that long closing, thank you very much, George, for joining us. And we look forward to speaking with you again.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks. See you soon.
Okay, take care.
Bye-bye.